Joseph Pawsey, born in rural Victoria. He was an Australian in the early 1900s. And in that period, there wasn't much basic research being done in Australia. But because of the sparse population, radio communication was quite important. So research was being done on how you could use radio waves to communicate over large distances. And that only works because the radio waves bounce off the ionosphere, and so that you can communicate over a large distance. So the Australians, including Joe Porzi, did his first degree at the University of Melbourne, working on the properties of this layer in the ionosphere, which reflected the radiation. He then won an award which enabled him to go to Cambridge in the United Kingdom, where he did his PhD with some of the top experts in the area of ionospheric research. But when the war broke out, then they needed people in Australia who could develop what was the top secret concept of radar. And the people who could do radar were people who'd worked on radio waves already, which is what Porzi had done. So he was hired and came back to Australia to become part of the group in CSIR, it was then, doing radar research used in World War II. At the end of the war, there was this group of people who had developed radar. But there was no longer the war, so what was going to happen in the peacetime? And CSIRO made what turned out to be an incredibly inspired decision to keep those people together to do research in using radio waves. Now, just before the Second World War, an American called Jansky had discovered radio waves coming from space to Earth. And so one idea was, nobody knew what these were, they didn't know how they were made, so the idea was that could be a research topic for this group. And in a few years, Australia had the biggest group of people doing research on what became radio astronomy. Perhaps his main contribution was to use the fact that you could determine the directions from which the radio waves were coming by what we call interference. So let me explain. At this time, they knew radio waves were coming from space, but they didn't know what was making the radio emission. And even though they could tell some came when the sun was up, they didn't know from where in the sun it came. So he introduced a clever technique, which he had already used for his PhD when he was in Cambridge, to observe the signal with an antenna, but at the same time, there's a reflected signal which comes off the sea. And depending on the direction, these two signals, they might add together or they might interfere, and that's where the term interference comes from. So this thing is called an interferometer. And so he's the one who introduced this concept into radio astronomy. He used to think quite a lot about how to do science. And our book gets huge value from the letters he wrote to his mother throughout his entire career, telling her what he thought about things. And that included the philosophy of science, the process of making new discoveries, and the fact that you need an open mind to follow up on all of the possibilities, that some discoveries are serendipitous, and he really understood that very well, and many discoveries were being made. The other thing he did, which for Australia was really important, is he traveled continually. So at that time, it was many months just to attend a meeting in a foreign country, in Europe or the US. So he spent about half of his time traveling around the world, because otherwise the scientists here had no real contact with what was going on in America and in England. And it was really trying to address the situation of an isolated country far away that drove him to this international science.